The dinner rush had barely started when a towering man in a sharp navy tracksuit stepped into La Maison d'Eau, the fanciest restaurant in town. Heads turned immediately. His presence alone could fill an entire room with tension. This was Big Shaq, a name that echoed through the city's streets, whispered in barbershops, and discussed in hushed tones in boardrooms alike. Known for his bold personality and even bolder business ventures, Big Shaq rarely showed up in person to his own establishments. But here he was tonight, and not for food. He was here on a quiet mission, one only he knew about, to see how things truly ran when no one realized the boss was watching. Under the soft glow of golden chandeliers, the restaurant bustled with finely dressed guests, clinking glasses, and murmured conversations. The white tablecloths looked freshly pressed. The silverware gleamed, and every dish leaving the kitchen was arranged like a masterpiece. On the outside, everything seemed perfect. Yet Big Shaq had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. In business, the truth often hid beneath layers of polite smiles and rehearsed greetings. So tonight, he chose to walk in without the usual warning call, the reserved table, or even the suit that screamed owner. Instead, he wore what he felt comfortable in, a navy tracksuit paired with simple gold chains, casual but unmistakably his style. Meanwhile, near the polished marble bar, a young waiter named Chris was wiping smudges off wine glasses. Chris had been working at La Maison d'Or for only a few months, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he knew it all. In his mind, he could spot the real VIPs from a mile away, the expensive watches, the designer suits, the quiet way they nodded instead of called for service. To him, these were the guests worth impressing. Everyone else? Just noise in the background. Chris glanced up as the door swung open and caught sight of Big Shaq walking in without so much as checking in with the hostess. The sight made him pause, glass still in hand. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing chains? Chris rolled his eyes instantly. Great, he muttered under his breath. So low only the stemware heard him. Another wannabe VIP to ruin my night. Chris turned his focus back to his polishing, though curiosity kept his eyes drifting toward the newcomer. He saw the hostess speak to Big Shaq, who simply nodded and chose a window-side table, usually reserved for guests with a weeks-long reservation. The hostess looked uneasy, but Big Shaq's quiet authority seemed to silence any protest. He simply sat, looked around the room, and folded his massive hands on the table, as though waiting for the show to begin. To Chris, it was all the confirmation he needed. Typical, he thought. Probably some street guy with more attitude than cash, thinking a gold chain is enough to buy respect. The truth, of course, was far from what Chris imagined. Big Shaq wasn't there to flaunt his status. He was there to test the very thing Chris thought he'd mastered: service. In his years of owning multiple restaurants, Shaq knew that service made or broke a restaurant's reputation. No matter how good the food or expensive the decor, if guests felt unwelcome, it all fell apart. From where he sat, Big Shaq could see everything. The bustling waitstaff weaving through tables, the bartenders pouring drinks with practiced flair, and the guests who seemed blissfully unaware of the silent inspection happening in their midst. Chris finished polishing his last glass and straightened his vest, deciding it was time to show the new arrival how things worked. With a half-bored, half-irritated expression, he made his way over to Big Shaq's table. Each step echoed faintly against the marble floor, and the closer he got, the more he noticed just how large this guest really was. Even seated, Big Shaq had an imposing presence. Yet Chris wasn't intimidated. Or so he told himself. In his mind, this was just another loud, overdressed customer trying to act important. "Evening," Chris began, his voice carrying the forced politeness of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "Can I help you?" Big Shaq looked up calmly, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Evening," he rumbled back, the bass in his voice almost vibrating the wine glasses. "How's the special tonight?" Chris barely hid a smirk. "Look, mate," he said, his tone dipping into disrespect. "Tables like this are usually reserved for real guests. You sure you can afford it?" At that moment, it wasn't just Big Shaq who heard those words. A couple at a nearby table paused mid-bite. The hostess's smile faltered. Even the bartender polishing a shaker froze, his eyes flickering toward the scene. But Chris didn't notice. He was too wrapped in his own certainty, too convinced he'd just saved the restaurant a wasted seat. To him, this was routine. To Big Shaq, it was the beginning of something that would change more than just a night. And just like that, the stage was set for a lesson neither Chris nor anyone else watching would ever forget. Big Shaq took a seat at a window-side table, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the crisp white tablecloth. The city lights outside reflected faintly on the glass, but inside, all eyes were on him. Without even glancing at the menu, he leaned back, lifted one hand with quiet authority, and gestured for Chris to come over. Chris walked toward him, forced confidence in every step. In his head, he had already judged this guest and made up his mind. Another flashy, noisy guy who would probably order the cheapest thing, tip nothing, and leave a mess. "Evening," Shaq said, his deep voice calm yet powerful, the kind that made people pause even if they didn't know why. "How's the special tonight?" Chris barely hid his irritation, rolling his eyes almost imperceptibly. "Look, mate," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "Tables like this are usually reserved for real guests. You sure you can afford it?" The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. For a second, it felt as if even the soft background music had stopped playing. Other diners, who had been busy with their conversations and glasses of wine, shifted in their seats. Forks hovered midair. Some pretended to keep chatting, but their eyes flickered back to the scene, curiosity getting the better of them. Shaq raised an eyebrow slowly, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me?" Chris crossed his arms, the smirk never leaving his face. "You heard me. People like you, tracksuits, gold chains, don't usually belong here. You'd probably be happier at a burger joint down the street." The insult was casual, almost tossed out like a scrap of food, but its impact was anything but small. For a moment, Big Shaq stayed completely silent, his gaze locked on Chris. It wasn't an angry stare, nor was it amused. It was the kind of look that could strip away every layer of bravado and get to the truth of someone. Chris felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, though he told himself to keep his cool. Around them, the quiet tension felt thicker than the crystal chandeliers hanging above. A woman at a nearby table placed her wine glass down carefully, her eyes wide. A man next to her whispered something under his breath, and the hostess near the entrance took a nervous step forward, ready to intervene. But Chris didn't back down. In his mind, he was just protecting the restaurant's image. After all, wasn't his job to keep out guests who didn't fit in? Big Shaq, still silent, leaned forward slightly. His massive frame seemed to fill the space between them, and Chris had to look up just to meet his eyes. "You think you know who belongs here?" Shaq's voice was lower now, quieter, but somehow even more commanding. Chris's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he caught himself. "I know enough," he replied, shrugging dismissively. "This place is for people who understand class, you know? Not guys who show up in sports gear flashing gold chains like they own the place." A tiny flicker of something flashed in Shaq's eyes, amusement maybe or disappointment. "Interesting," he murmured. Chris raised his chin, almost defiant. "Look, don't take it personally. I'm just telling you how it is. Places like this, they're not for everyone." At that, Big Shaq finally leaned back in his chair again, folding his hands calmly on the table. His silence spoke louder than words. The room, too, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. From the other side of the dining room, the manager had seen enough. Red-faced and nervous, he rushed over, the soles of his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor. "Chris," he hissed, voice tight with panic. "What are you doing?" "Step away." "Now!" But Chris, his confidence faltering now, tried to explain. "I'm just trying to make sure we keep the right image, boss." The manager cut him off sharply. "Do you even know who you're speaking to?" Chris blinked. "No, who?" And then Big Shaq spoke, his words clear, unhurried, but as solid as stone. "Funny," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "because I own this place." He pulled out a sleek black card embossed with the restaurant's gold logo. Calmly, he placed it on the table, sliding it forward with a single finger. "My name's on the back," he added, voice almost gentle now. Chris's mouth opened, but no words came out. His face drained of color. Around them, diners exchanged shocked glances, whispers rippling across the room like a wave. The waiter who had been filling a water glass stopped mid-pour, staring wide-eyed. Big Shaq watched Chris quietly, letting the moment sink in. "You judged me by my clothes," he said, voice still calm. "You didn't even bother to look me in the eye and see the person sitting in front of you." The chandelier's light caught the gold lettering on the card as Chris stared down, speechless, his earlier arrogance replaced by a single overwhelming thought. What have I done? And in that silent, frozen moment, the entire restaurant learned a lesson about respect they would never forget. A manager, who had been nervously observing, hurried over. "Chris, please, go help at another table," he whispered, pulling Chris aside. Chris shrugged him off. "Relax, boss. I'm just keeping the riffraff out." Before the manager could argue, Big Shaq finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "You think you know who belongs here?" Chris folded his arms. "I know exactly who belongs and who doesn't." Big Shaq leaned back, smiling slightly. "Funny, because I own this place." Silence. Plates stopped clinking, forks hovered midair, and every head turned to Chris. Chris's face turned ghostly pale. "You own it? No way." Big Shaq reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a sleek black card embossed with the restaurant's logo, and laid it on the table. "Name's on the back, kid." Chris felt sweat drip down his neck. His cocky grin vanished. Big Shaq stood up. His shadow seemed twice as big under the crystal chandelier. "You judge me by my clothes, my chains, but you didn't look me in the eye. Didn't see the person, only the surface." The manager stepped in, stuttering apologies. "Mr. Shaq, please, let me handle this." Big Shaq shook his head gently. "Chris, let me teach you something. Real class isn't in the suit you wear, but in the respect you show. Everyone who walks through those doors deserves it, whether they're wearing a tux or a tracksuit." Chris swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know." Shaq's gaze softened. It's easy to be sorry when you're caught. Harder to treat everyone right from the start. Instead of firing Chris on the spot, Big Shaq did something unexpected. "Tomorrow, you'll spend the day with me. I'll show you what it means to run a place like this, and what it means to respect every customer." Chris nodded, humbled. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The rest of the night, Chris worked silently but with genuine effort, his earlier arrogance replaced by quiet respect. Word spread quickly among the staff and diners about what had happened, and everyone looked at Big Shaq with new eyes, not just as a wealthy owner, but as someone who demanded respect for all. Before leaving, Big Shaq turned to Chris one last time. "Remember, you never know who you're talking to. Treat them all like they matter because they do." Chris bowed his head. "I will, sir." As Shaq stepped out into the night, the gold letters of La Maison d'Or reflected in the windows behind him. He hadn't just owned the restaurant. He'd owned the moment, teaching a lesson not just to Chris, but to everyone watching. Final words for viewers. Sometimes the biggest bosses wear the simplest clothes. And sometimes respect is the most expensive thing you can offer, but it costs nothing to give. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories where lessons come wrapped in the most unexpected moments.